and welcome to Aliens Revealed Live. I'm your host, Dean Caparella, here on the Paranormal UK radio network. From alien abductions to monster-infested ranches, men in black, near-death experiences, close encounter experiences and more, we speak to some of the most amazing people on the planet, ready and willing to share their chilling stories with you. And they all come from the Aliens Revealed Live files here on the Paranormal UK radio network. Well, how did James Forrestal really die, and was his death part of an alien conspiracy? There are so many unanswered questions surrounding the latter stages of James Forrestal's life. For example, was his death part of an alien conspiracy? What was James Forrestal's involvement with MJ12? What happened to his revered diary? Was his death suicide or murder? And why was he being followed by foreign-looking men, which some say were the men in black? James Forrestal achieved a lot in life before his untimely death on May 22, 1949, and despite his achievements, he'll be remembered for something a little more sinister. In reality, Forrestal's mysterious death may never be solved, and we may never know the real truth. James Forrestal should be remembered as an extraordinary American and a true patriot, according to investigative writer and author Peter Robbins. He feels that the former Secretary of Defense doesn't deserve to go down in US folklore as just another conspiracy case. Robbins has written several bestsellers on conspiracies and murders, and these include Left at Eastgate, which he co-authored, Deliberate Deception, and the riveting Halt in Woodbridge, an Air Force colonel's 38-year fight to silence an authentic UFO whistleblower. Forrestal didn't appear to be himself in the lead-up to his demise, and according to Peter Robbins, there was something worrying him. Robbins has spent several decades studying the life of James Forrestal and has left no stone unturned in trying to discover the truth. He released a documentary in late 2019 and gives a comprehensive account of the life of America's first ever Secretary of Defense. It's titled James Forrestal, His Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death. Robbins presented some startling research on James Forrestal during Aliens Revealed Live. So would a jury find his death as murder or suicide if all the evidence was presented in today's court system? Robbins' response is quite decisive and not surprising given the nature of the evidence he's gathered in his research. In the book, The Assassination of James Forrestal, released in 2019, another author, David Martin, says, the official report, in fact, did not conclude that Forrestal committed suicide. It only concluded that the fall caused his death and that no one in the US Navy was responsible for it. Popular conspiracy theories are part and parcel of today's society. After all, who doesn't like a good conspiracy? The US has had a history littered with more conspiracies than most countries. How about Roswell, or the Kennedy assassination, or the death of Marilyn Monroe? Heck, there's even some conspiracy attached to the death of Elvis. Has anyone spotted him lately? In ufology, the death of former Secretary of Defense James Forrestal is one of the most popular conspiracy theories of all, and Peter Robbins is here to talk about it. Hi, Peter.
Thank you. It's good to be on with you.
I thought I'd start firstly with, and of course there's lots of questions surrounding James Forrestal's death, but firstly, who was he and why does he matter to history?
Yeah, that's the lead question for sure. James Forrestal was an extraordinary American, a true patriot, and how can I say, a man who, in his life, public service came first. He was a very successful broker on Wall Street in the 1920s and into the 30s. At the invitation of the Roosevelt administration, as they were getting themselves out of the economic depression, he was invited to join a select group of very successful American businessmen, often referred to as the kitchen cabinet. A bit of a pun there, or the $1-a-year men, because in fact, for the time that they came to Washington and served at the pleasure of the president, they were paid a token sum of $1 a year. As the economy got better, literally all of these men returned to their private lives and continued to make money. James Forrestal did not. He stayed in Washington for the rest of his life to serve at the pleasure of 2 American presidents. He went on to become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the pre-war, And then toward the end of the war, when the Secretary of Navy died of a heart attack, he became the Secretary of Navy. One of the things that distinguishes him as a public person was in that official capacity as a cabinet secretary, he did not remain at his desk in the Pentagon. He was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Tokyo Bay. He continued to put himself in harm's way, was an extraordinary team player, seemed to thrive in the high-stress atmosphere of Washington during the war. In April of 1945, President Roosevelt died. President Truman was sworn in. And after the war, Truman selected Forrestal to dismantle America's old War Department, which had been in place since the Revolutionary War, and create a new entity that became known as the Department of Defense. He could have chosen a gilt-edged committee of individuals, more than qualified to do it, but he selected this one man, and by all accounts, Forrestal did a brilliant job, and we have the legacy in terms of our modern military defense establishment here in the United States. In the spring of 1947, President nominated him to be the first Secretary of Defense. By acclamation, both houses of our Congress voted 100% with the president, and he was sworn in very suddenly in the second half of September of 1947. This is where the story kind of shifts gears. One of the things I present in the documentary is the extraordinary weight of responsibilities that fell on him and succeeding secretaries of defense. In essence, he became the second most powerful man in what we used to call the free world, and was charged directly by Truman with getting to the bottom of a mystery that had emerged less than 2 months earlier, with two events. On June 24th, the famous Kenneth Arnold UFO sightings over Washington state, and then a week later, the crash of an unknown object in the plains some miles from what was then a small town in New Mexico called Roswell. In studying Forrestal, whose life obsessed me on and off for some decades, two extraordinary, I'll call them character flaws emerged. One was that he seemed incapable of forging a truly deep, penetrating friendship with anyone. He had many friends. He was an extraordinarily charismatic individual, often described the way people used to describe President Kennedy. He was the kind of person that when he walked into a room, be it an official event or a party, he was the one that attention centered on. He was the one, as they sometimes say, that all the guys wanted to have a drink with and all the women wanted to sleep with. And sleep with many of them he did. But very, again, like Kennedy, just so much intimacy, not beyond. The other event, and I think it kind of really helped unwind him, sadly, was as an extraordinary achiever who came from very modest means. I chose this story in part because it has a ring of literature. It almost doesn't seem like he was real. And there's a very famous American novel from the 1920s called The Great Gatsby that was made into films twice, most recently with Leo DiCaprio in the starring role some years back. If F. Scott Fitzgerald had wanted to base Gatsby on a real person, it might as well have been James Forrestal. He had the habit of personalizing all of his professional and personal successes and failures. And with the most powerful defense establishment in history at his beck and call, after a year and a half at the job, he was unable to do anything really to discern the true nature of the truly anomalous UFO phenomenon and what it represented in terms of its implications for humanity. Most of us who are hard workers and try to do our best, if we fail at something or don't meet our or the assigned goals that we've been given in life or work, we still actually are allegorically, we'll go home that night, have dinner with the husband and wife or whomever, pet the dog, watch some television, and try to do a better job next day. With Mr. Forrestal, it ate him up inside. This coupled with the fact that he lost the president's confidence, sadly in part because powerful men around him who were somewhat jealous of Truman's closeness with Forrestal, spun a fabrication that he was disloyal. Not only was that not true, but here was a man who probably would have willingly died for the two presidents that he served. He was a true patriot and an extraordinarily public-spirited citizen. The fact was, he knew everything that Truman knew about the UFO phenomena. And unlike Truman, he was the one who was supposed to get to the bottom of it. If we're to believe the official account, whatever was building up inside him, that turmoil, really unwound literally the day that he stepped down as the first Secretary of State and the second Secretary of State came in. Within 24 hours, he had tried to commit suicide. He tried again. He was institutionalized at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in the state of Maryland, kept heavily sedated for 2 weeks, and then began to undergo treatment that would have been most appropriate in 1949 for deep depression, but especially so as a VIP patient at the hospital. After all, he was a former Secretary of Navy. I have seen the hospital records, or most of them. I've read every published account by everybody that visited him, read all the relevant newspaper coverage, and in every case, without exception, he was getting better. He was, his will to live had returned. He was responding to treatment well, and so much so that his brother one of his brothers arranged for him to be released from the hospital on Sunday, May 22nd of 1949 to complete his recovery at the estate of a well-to-do friend, which would have been most appropriate and probably just the right thing for him. But allegedly, he went into a completely unpredicted depression, found his room door open in the middle of the night, decided to hang himself or choke himself to death or jump out the window, or a combination of all three. And America the next morning learned the tragic news that officially the secretary had committed suicide. In this documentary, I, working with a little lawyer in my head for many years, present the case that he was murdered and then lay out the reasons why. It is a story for me that is a true American success story that flips toward the end into high Greek tragedy. The upshot of all of this is that James Forrestal, after a brief period of national mourning, was all but forgotten by the American public. And I dare say many of your listeners have never heard his name, unless perhaps they live in Princeton, New Jersey. He attended Princeton almost until graduation time, left 3 weeks before graduation to join the Navy and fight in World War I. The war ended, he went to Wall Street. And there is a Princeton campus named after him, a shopping center named after him. Also for Navy personnel and Navy veterans or families thereof, they may be aware that the very first nuclear aircraft carrier, christened in 1956, was the USS Forrestal. I have made it my job to reintroduce his name, to couple it with an awareness of the early days of the UFO cover-up, of which he was, for me, in part, most certainly a casualty. And I guess also in these trying times in this country, where words like patriot are bandied about very cheaply to remind Americans and anyone else what the real meaning of the word was. I hope people watch the documentary, and I hope they find some value in it.
If all the evidence that you've gathered over the years was presented in today's court system, do you think a jury would come up with a verdict of suicide or murder?
I'm quite convinced, although one could say I'm not objective. I think I'm ultra objective, or I would not have chosen to present this case, that they would most certainly decide it was a case of murder.
Okay. It's also, I guess he was a de facto key player in the formulation of the UFO policy. So is there a connection between UFOs and his death?
Yes. I say this from the point of view of somebody who's not a mental health professional, but with some pride, that for 8 years, with several very necessary breaks, I worked as a volunteer and then a volunteer and a shift supervisor at the busiest suicide hotline in America, the offices of a brilliantly important British-based organization called Samaritans International, where people like me were not trained to be, fake psychologists. We were trained, though, to be available to people who were depressed, mentally ill, suicidal, lonely. And in that time, I interfaced with quite a number of psychologists and psychiatrists in my private life and in that part of my life who had come to specialize in suicide. The circumstances surrounding the alleged suicide are patently absurd. And what I heard from every person I presented the case to was that in their experience, jumpers jump, and people who want to hang themselves, hang themselves. They don't try to hang themselves out of a window of a 16th floor building. In any case where somebody is so terribly in despair that they are considering ending their life, those of us who have been fortunate enough not to be standing on that actual or allegorical ledge, you sometimes come to think that their mind is clouded and full of confusion, where that may be the case in some instances. Also, that it's often not one reason, it's a complexity of reasons. And I think that that was the case with Mr. Forrestal. It was not just one reason. However, I have come to believe incontrovertibly that a major consulting reason was the tremendous sense of personal failure that he had, and the understanding that in the minds of very powerful individuals in Washington, by having a nervous breakdown, and a very public one at that, that he could not only no longer be trusted, but that he knew where all the bodies were buried, if you know what I mean. He knew all the secrets and what happened if he recovered and then had a relapse. I think James Forrestal not only understood this, but it was so clear to him that in his mind, as a patriotic American who had done his best and failed miserably in his estimate, that he knew he had to die. And the two instances of suicide that sadly I was able to fully document leading up to his institutionalization was him acting like a good Roman soldier and trying to throw himself on his sword, but literally stopped by individuals around him who cared.
Yep.
When he began to truly recover and regain his will to live, he signed his own death warrant. And as I make note of in the documentary, I think it's fair to say that the individuals who would have had to have been very highly placed, who forced him out that 16th floor window, may well have had great respect and admiration for him. But as they say in the mob, it's nothing personal. It's just focus. He had to go. Let's also remember here that now in current day America, and I feel around what we refer to as the first world, every single one of us either has been or knows somebody, be it a family member, a friend, a business associate, a neighbor, who has seen a therapist or a psychiatrist or a counselor or a psychologist at one time or another, or their kids have. Going back to 1949, this was not only not the case, but probably 99 out of 100 Americans had never known anybody who had put themselves into this kind of position. As Archie Bunker used to say, you got to be crazy to see a psychiatrist. It was simply not done. And as you study Forrestal's life, he really emerges as kind of an ultimate alpha male.
Yeah.
He was not just somebody who kept in shape. He was a very competitive tennis player, a professional level golfer. He was a passionate amateur boxer, even into his serious career. It was a sport that he loved very much. He was charismatic. He was tough. When he was in university, he had his nose broken in an amateur boxing match, and he decided not to have it reset because he thought it would make him look tougher in life, and you see photos of him. However, he was also a very sensitive soul. He studied the classics at Princeton. One of the major accounts that emerges surrounding the evening of his death was when looked in by an attendant. He was copying a Sophocles poem out of an anthology onto hospital stationery. And all of these factors count in the tragedy that emerged.
He also, during the days leading up to his death, or maybe even well before, reports that he was concerned about being followed by foreign-looking men, and there's reports suggesting that they resembled the infamous Men in Black. I mean, is there any truth to that?
Yes and no. I was extremely careful in pulling together what amounted to 30 plus years on and off of research, of keeping away from rumors, myths, legends, even very popular ones with a hint of possibility behind them somewhere. For example, there are, with him and Truman, there are several days in their daily logs in July of 1947 where they're not accounted for. Did he visit Roswell in July of 1947? He may have, but I cannot say that with certainty, so I build on other things. There's a very fine film about another major player in Roswell, Major Jesse Marcel Sr., the Roswell Army Airfield Base intelligence officer, whose life was destroyed, literally destroyed, by his being the military individual to follow up on his base commander's orders and to let the world know that they had parts of a crashed, truly anomalous UFO. He was forced the next day to pose with fragments of a mobile weather balloon, and that photograph went out to papers all over the world. Jesse became an alcoholic and chronically depressed. I'm off on a tangent here. The reason I bring it up, though, is because a good friend of mine, a brilliant artist and filmmaker and writer, a true Renaissance man, Paul Davids, made a very fine film some years ago called Roswell about Jesse. However, there is a sequence in it where an actor playing James Forrestal is in a secret location in Roswell looking through a glass window into a room with a gray type alien. And the implication in the scene is that this being got into his head, and that was what destabilized him. Forrestal reported in the days leading up to his breakdown, two Navy officials, his servant, who the FBI took an account from, that he was concerned about strange men possibly being on the property. I don't remember any description of how they were dressed, but they might as well have been, or at least allegorically, men in black, so to speak. As they say, though, you don't have to be paranoid to know that somebody is following you.
Exactly. He had a shaky relationship with the Air Force Secretary at the time, William Symington. Did this have any bearing on his eventual demise? There was a secret conversation that took place the day he stepped down, and Symington, I think, pulled him aside and said something to him that reports say really, really worried him.
That's a very good question. Is Stuart Symington, and he was the first Secretary of the Air Force. One has to remember that until the reorganization under Forrestal, there was a Department of the Department of War, Department of the Army, Department of the Navy. The new boy in town, the Air Force, was now competing for available funds with the other military service branches. And Symington was particularly aggressive in the manner that he did it, adding stress to Forrestal's life. Immediately following the change of command ceremony, indeed, Symington was heard saying to Forrestal, quote unquote, "There's something I would like to talk to you about." Nobody knows the conversation that followed, but Forrestal was noted sometime later to have disappeared from the room, and a thorough search followed within that very large building for him. He was found in his old office, sitting behind his desk, and when whomever the individuals were opened the door, the accounts are that he was literally sitting at the desk, staring at the wall, repeating the phrase, "You are a loyal fellow. You are a loyal fellow."
Peter, was Forrestal a member of the MJ-12 group?
He was. In taking this subject on for the documentary, I made a decision based on 30 years of arguing among ufologists and historians about the reality viability of this ultra top secret, above top secret, so to say, working group that we are to understand that President Truman created in response to trying to get to the bottom of the event. MJ-12 broke in, I believe, the spring of 1987. It's quite a legendary story in ufology, whereby Stanton Friedman, a researcher named Jamie Chandray, and a legendary spook. I could go to my bookshelf right now and find it, but a roll of film was sent and developed, and 9 pages emerged. 8 pages are purported to be a briefing document to then President-elect Eisenhower, who won the presidency in 1952. It lays out a brief history of the UFO phenomena. Hundreds of pages, allegedly, from MJ-12 have emerged since. I have some real issues with the reality or the viability of many of these documents. However, I should say so many of them are so intriguing for the reason that if they're fake, they're not, something that was knocked out in somebody's basement on a period typewriter. They are remarkable in terms of mimicking or illustrating linguistic and writing quirks among people as well known as Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein. For example, many of us, when we write, will have a habit of inverting a preposition, or substituting a semicolon for a colon, things like that, which leads me to feel ultimately over the years that if they're fake, they're intriguing in the level of care that was done to create them. But when all comes down to it, I have to concur with my late friend, mentor, and colleague Stanton Friedman, who really did extraordinary research into the subject and was able to locate 2 documents in the National Archives referring to a working group called MJ-12, not surprisingly, not referring to what it was about. The 9th page that emerged in this original release was a letter from a very brief letter marked eyes only from President Truman to then new Secretary of Defense Forrestal, requesting that he move ahead in the matter discussed with all possible speed. It would have made sense, of course, for such a working group to exist. And like many of my colleagues, once the information had come out, I made it my business to start to research the lives of these various men. Again, this goes back to '87. We're in pretty much pre-digital times. I have notebook after notebook of cut and paste, of excerpts from out-of-print memoirs. Would these men have likely have been the ones that Truman would have chosen? Were they qualified for their jobs? Were there connections between them in real life? And in all cases, the answer is yes. And Forrestal was certainly among them.
Yeah. The possible smoking gun and all this, as far as evidence goes, was his diary. Was that ever recovered?
Yes and no. Unlike most of us who have kept diaries, the image that comes to mind is a little book with a lock on it, like a high school girl might keep for her secrets. Mr. Forrestal's marriage was bust from the start. His wife, Josephine Ogden, was a very beautiful woman. She was an editor at Vogue magazine, a former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl. It was a very, big society marriage, but he did not, I'm sorry, I just completely got distracted. There's no way I can, I know what I can do to get rid of that sound. Hold on. Okay.
Yep.
He married a woman named Josephine Ogden. And is that a good place to start?
Yeah.
Okay, once again. James Forrestal married a woman named Josephine Ogden, who came from a distinguished old Southern family that was now financially kind of with its back to the wall, but she had the right pedigree he was looking for. She was a beautiful woman, an editor at Vogue magazine, a former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl, and the marriage was kind of hollow from the start, because he began seeing other women almost immediately. She had her own lovers after that, and he had very little to go home to at night. But he wanted a record of his public life. And so after work, and he would often work till about 8 or so at night, and then stay at the Pentagon till midnight, a naval secretary would come in and he would dictate to him everyone he had met during the day, the subject of their conversations, his observations about the people that he was dealing with. And so it went. In January of 1949, 2 months before he was due to step down as the Secretary for Defense, he contacted the White House. And kind of an unusual request, he asked the White House to take possession of his quote-unquote diary. At this time in American history, high-level bureaucrats would often take all of their paperwork with them. Forrestal refused to do this, and his reason was there were too many secret and top-secret papers in this archive. The diary was said to have filled a standard filing cabinet, and that was confirmed by the investigative reporters at the New York Times who did the actual work on this back then. I calculated that a foot, counting across the tops of sheets of paper, and depending on whether it was onion skin or, the kind of paper that we use today, would be about 2,000 pages. So we had some tens of thousands of pages that constituted this diary. In 1951, obviously several years following his death, an American publisher, and I think I have it here, yeah, got permission to publish, so to say, the Forrestal Diary.
Okay.
It was a national bestseller. It's a substantial book. It runs almost 600 pages, and it is excerpts from this actual diary. Interestingly, on the liner notes on the back of the book, the publisher discusses the fact that they were able to gain access to the 2,800 pages of his diary. Obviously, that's what they were given, and that's what they assumed was the number of pages. So it was already highly redacted. Obviously, there were things that were none of their business and that none of us should have been privy to. They were legitimately secret and top secret. However, what was presented as the diary to the American public was very much a deception. And almost needless to say, there was not even the hint of a reference to anything regarding the UFO phenomena. By the way, it's never gone back into print, but one can chase it down in used bookstores and on sites that deal with how to print books. And it makes very interesting reading. You get a very real picture of this man's incredibly sharp and observant mind as you read his accounts.
Last question on James Forrestal. Given the sensitive nature of his death and the mysterious nature of it, have you had or do you get much pushback on your research?
No. And I would say the same thing for my many years in UFO studies. Occasionally we are made aware, usually by the individual themselves, that the government is watching them and tapping their phones and doing things to frighten them off. There was a period in the late 1980s where I was concerned about such things happening to me. I did have my telephone checked out professionally. I did learn that there was monitoring of the phone irregularly, and that was quite unnerving to me. Mm-hmm. Nobody has ever come forward to try to quiet me about this, in part because I'm one guy. I've written quite a number of papers on Forrestal. I've published articles. I've spoken about him at different conferences around the country. I think the popular wisdom among those who move the chess pieces around is people like me are best left alone, because if something unforetold were to happen to me, that, even if it was completely explainable in conventional terms, there would certainly be a wider sphere of interest on possible dark doings. But ultimately, when you think about it, with the exception of maybe a widely publicized radio interview with a big audience, or doing a piece in a documentary that will go on television and also reach a substantial audience, how many people do we really reach? What damage do we really do? Mm-hmm. And in a way, leading into another topic, people like me are useful, in a funny way, in helping lay the ground for what is happening anyway, which is more and more general interest in the subject of classified matters, specifically in this case, the UFO phenomena, and reasons for keeping the lid on it for so many decades now. So I guess in a funny way, we play a part in a process that can no longer be stopped.
Right. And be a fascinating subject to talk about on its own, mysterious deaths over the years. But so bottom line is, James Forrestal, perhaps he just knew too much.
He did know too much. And had he not taken it so much to heart and personalized it and come undone around his personal sense that he had failed the President of the United States, and by extension, history. And the concerns based on a much more naive understanding, perhaps, of the phenomena of breakdowns. He had to die. He had to die. And that, for me, is one of the great American tragedies, and something that I am dedicated to trying to bring to public attention here and abroad.
Lastly, Peter, just before you go, I'm asking everyone about their thoughts on disclosure. Do you have any thoughts on disclosure? And if it does happen, what do you think the world will look like post-disclosure?
I certainly do have thoughts on it. I began my involvement in this subject in the mid-1970s. And with the advent of the internet and the advent, not that it's a good thing, of widely promoted views on conspiracies, often without the tiniest shred of factual information to back them up, in part led by the current presidents of the United States, it's become more than fashionable for people to bandy about any kind of theory, and much of it comes back to the UFO phenomena. It's fair to say, and this is my experience, that over the past decade especially, more and more people who previously would never have voiced any interest in this subject to friends, relatives, business associates, what have you, more and more people care less and less what other people think about what they think about the subject of UFOs. That's very healthy. There are now people who would never have, publicly voiced that they take the subject seriously, who are now quite outspoken about it, and a goodly percentage of them are retirement age and up. A good percentage of those who have some means to, they're not worried about what their boss is going to think, or even their neighbors. They're starting to go to the conferences, read the books, watch documentaries. I think for anybody who's waiting for that magic moment when the American government, where the secrecy began, and where the worst repression of any real information coming out, unlike many other governments at this point, waiting for them to come clean, shouldn't be holding their breath. Part of the problem is that, let's just say we lived in a world where one world leader could simply come forward and make all this public, and maybe someday one of them will. But now it's much more complicated. Mm-hmm. A responsible world leader would have to network with other world leaders, with world religious leaders, leading figures in the world of psychology, the economy, science. It would have to be well coordinated. But hypothetically, if, let's say, the president of the United States, this president, the last president, the next president were to come forward on television one night in, a special press conference and say, my fellow Americans and citizens of the world, it is my solemn duty to inform you, etc. They would be admitting by implication that every single president since Harry Truman, and including Harry Truman, was an unindicted co-conspirator mm-hmm. in the greatest secret, the greatest deception in the history of humanity. And that's a touchy subject for powerful people. Yep. They also might have to admit, if pushed to it, how little they've actually learned. And let's face it, the people in these positions are very much the inheritors of the people that were there at the beginning, around Harry Truman in the summer of 1947. They're powerful white guys, and many of them with big egos and a certain fragility about being seen as wrong or weak or impotent in terms of getting to the bottom of this. So we're dealing with a certain kind of human frailty, as well as the real reality of how do you get this information out. Also, and this is something that I've gone up against with Stephen Greer, a well-known figure in the so-called disclosure movement, mm-hmm. And I consider Steve Bassett, who I would say is central to this work. to be a good friend and an esteemed colleague, and somebody I have immeasurable respect for in his extraordinary dedicated quest to build a disclosure movement here and abroad, that there are problems that are not being fully thought out among those who are just pushing for disclosure per se. It's one thing to say we're not alone in the universe. It's another thing to say we are being visited by beings from other parts of the universe, other parts of the solar system, other dimensions, take your pick, without then getting into some of the really disturbing material that's associated with it. I became involved in this work because one of my sisters told me, again, back in the mid-'70s, about very clear but fragmented memories of what we would now call an archetypical UFO abduction experience. It was completely destabilizing to me, and my obsession became manifest overnight, and my intended career kind of jumped the tracks, and here I am talking to you about this. The thing of it is, though, I very soon met and became good friends with a man named Bud Hopkins, who, this was some years before he published his first book on the subject, like me. He was a painter, a New York-based artist who had become very seriously interested in the subject. And I went on to become a friend of his for 35 years, almost, well, probably more than half of that time, at least on and off, working as his assistant, and interfaced with hundreds of people over the years who had had this abduction experience. We have situations, many of them shockingly well documented, again, in terms you could bring to court, of hybrids, missing fetuses, stuff that's so disturbing and so difficult to find a willing audience willing to go through the documentation, the medical records, the interpersonal accounts of people associated. My point is, how do you dig half a hole? How do you just say we're not alone in the universe without opening this up in a way that will be, to put it mildly, extremely anxiety-provoking to many people? Bud used to joke that if the secret ever did unwind and came out, attendance at churches, synagogues, and mosques would go up all over the world. Alcohol sales would go up all over the world. Drug taking would go up. Mental institutions would have more and more folks in them. But it's not funny. I think in the world of folks who are active in the disclosure movement, and I applaud their efforts, many people tend to forget that after X number of years of study, or less time for some people, that they're ready, or they feel they're ready for this brave new world that will greet us after the fact. What they're not considering is that we, who take this seriously, we who feel we have enough information to brace ourselves for whatever implications happen, are ready, that we represent a very modest minority of our fellow citizens and the citizens of the world. Overall, primarily good people, working, following their dreams, trying to pay their bills, support their families, hope they have health coverage when they need it, that they have some kind of cushion to come back to when they retire. And this is going to be very difficult for a lot of regular folks. I've heard the argument, and it forms a substantial part of a paper I wrote some years ago, that particularly for people of faith, this is going to be a particular challenge because it will somehow interfere with or challenge their notions of their belief in God. I've come to feel that that is probably exaggerated, and that, if anything, it should substantiate the idea of creation and the miracle of creation, whether you see it from a purely theological point or from a secular point. As you know, just the miracle of Darwinian evolution, that it should only reinforce that idea of that divine spark, call it God, if you will, that doesn't stop at the ionosphere, but goes out to the very edges of space and into different dimensions, possibly. It's all theoretical.
Okay, Peter, thanks for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and good luck with the documentary, James Forrestal, His Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death. That's investigative writer and author Peter Robbins joining us. Philip Mantle has been researching, investigating and writing on the UFO mystery for more than 40 years. He says in that time the stigma attached to UFOs and aliens has lessened somewhat.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, in my day, you would do as much as you could face to face. You know, that would mean traveling and, you know, wherever possible and interviewing the witnesses face to face, going to the locations where these incidents and all sightings happened and so on. If things were a bit further away, we literally had a UFO sighting report form, like a questionnaire, if you like, that you would send to people and have them complete, or you would write to them or phone them, you know. And it was a lot, I don't know if it was any better, but it certainly took a lot longer to certainly think about it. And when you were part of an organization like that, you had sightings of all different kinds come your way, Dean, you know, from the lights in the sky to things seen on the ground, photographs, sometimes a bit of film. So, you know, you really had to be a jack of all trades to be involved correctly, you know. So some people went on to concentrate on a particular type of sighting or encounter, but, you know, I've just dealt with what's ever come my way, you know. So things were certainly a lot slower in those days.
And it seems like it's ramped up a few levels now, because it seems back in those days it was more about sightings than actual alien contact.
Yeah, I mean, there was, I think the stigma that's attached to, we'll call them close encounters for want of a better phrase, has diminished down the decades from when I first started. You know, to get people to even be interviewed in private about an encounter was never that easy, simply because of this stigma, which the stigma was largely because of the way the media treated the subject. And then, of course, things began to change slowly but surely, you know, when we had people like Dr. John Mack, Harvard professor, become involved. Here in the UK, we had Nick Pope from the Ministry of Defence become involved. It gave the subject an air of credibility. And that goes up and down as time passes, you know, as peaks and troughs. But, you know, I don't think the TV series, for example, The X-Files, did any great harm. It brought the subject into everybody's living room. And even now, most people will know the word Roswell. And all they'll know is that's where the spaceship crashed. You know, won't necessarily know a lot more about it. But back when I first started, you know, Roswell wasn't even mentioned anywhere. I mean, you know, it's as simple as that. It had yet to be reborn, so to speak. So, you know, the stigma is still there, but I don't think it's as great as it used to be. Therefore, when there's serious reporting of the subject, people who have had these encounters do tend to relax somewhat and are able to speak about it.
That's Philip Mantle. Philip talks about all things UFO in next week's show, from stigmas to close encounters, and what he's seen change during the past 4 decades. It's coming up on the next episode of the Aliens Revealed Live Files. Thanks for being with us. Don't forget to check out our website at arlhub.com. That's arlhub.com. And as always, keep looking upwards and take care.